Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the presentation of this new book that George Yip is launching on China and its innovators. And I'm delighted to be here presenting the session and welcoming all of you to this for many different reasons that I'll talk to you about. First, George has been a dedicated professor, now transitioning into emeritus status, but we're very fortunate to keep a slice of his time, and that tells us something about his devotion to academia and to intellectual leadership. And this is something that I think makes it a real pleasure to be here presenting the book, because one of the things that has always characterized George is throughout his long career with a lot of senior roles, he's always been able and always been committed to keep that intellectual drive to publish, to be engaged in intellectually and in research, and that's something that's a tribute to his intellectual commitment, his commitment to intellectual leadership. So that's the first element. The second element relates to the topics and how they are connected to the school strategy. And innovation and China are two elements that are really crucial to the present and the future of the economy in general and of the school in particular. I mean, being the business school of Imperial College, innovation and entrepreneurship have been very much at the heart of what the school is and how the school goes about communicating and integrating with all its stakeholders. So that it's very present in intellectual leadership, and so we have an amazing group of scholars in this area that is at the cutting edge of research, whether it is about new business model for digital transformation, the future of work, advanced analytics for related to social transformation, or what's happening with blockchain, from how to fund deep tech. These are all things that are very much at the heart of what we do as researchers, and something that is present through the scholarly effort that we basically push through the school. That is, of course, also very present in our educational activities, right? I mean, we have innovation entrepreneurship is very much present across all our programs. I mean, that's not surprising why, for example, our MBA is a top-ranked program from the point of view of entrepreneurship. That's also why we have a very successful program, a master's program, Innovation and Entrepreneurship Management, because this is very much at the heart of what we think is critical for the school now and into the future. But also China. I mean, we have a very substantial presence historically of people from Asia in the school, and almost close to, I would say, close to 30% of our student community is probably coming from China in this day across our programs. So our connection historically and in this present day with China is quite important, and particularly important from the point of view of innovation. Because of this connection that we've had with China, we've been having a variety of continuous engagement with China. And so last year I was in Tianjin, in Beijing, and Shanghai, as well as in Hong Kong, and in Shenzhen, doing a variety of events and meetings to not only meet our alumni and understand what they're doing, but to connect to the local entrepreneurial environment. And you can see how much is happening there. And if you want to be at the cutting edge of innovation and entrepreneurship, you have to understand China. If you don't understand China and what's happening with the innovators in China, you're not understanding what's happening in innovation and entrepreneurship. And so for all these reasons, right, when we have the opportunity to have a presentation on the book that really looks at what's happening with these leading innovators in China, it really brings all these elements together. It brings the intellectual leadership that we want to be pushing as the forefront and a very important anchor of what we have in the school. It connects to both what we do in terms of our students and our community, but very importantly, it connects to this part of the world that in many areas it is at the forefront of innovation, and therefore, pushing our understanding on this area is quite critical. And then to finish where I started, the pleasure of having a fantastic contributor to the school to come and present the book here. So thank you very much for coming and sharing and participating in this presentation. And I very much look forward to the session and to our special guest that I'll present in a second, that's going to be doing a preamble on the book in terms of what we're going to have. And so right after my own presentation, we're going to have Lord Clement-Jones to talk to us a little bit about China and innovation in a broader sense. Just a little bit of an introduction. Besides being the former chair of the Liberal Party, the current chair of council of the Queen Mary University, and deputy chair of the All-Parliamentary Commission on China and the economy related issues in particular. And so thank you very much for coming to contribute to our session and to give us this introduction. Thank you all, and looking forward to the session.
Well, Francisco, thank you very much indeed. As you can see, I'm just the distraction before you hear the real meat from George. Now, my essay was the importance of China to the UK economy, and I'm just going to talk for a little bit about that, because, of course, not a day goes by without some news on the economic front, or the business front, or the trade front with China, particularly in view of the current trade war with the US. But I wanted to say, first of all, what a pleasure it was to be present at the launch of this very important contribution to our knowledge of innovative Chinese businesses and their contribution to both the Chinese and the global economy, not least because I know the rigor with which the subject has been approached and the authority and experience which George and colleagues bring to the subject. Now, for a number of years, I was a member of the International Advisory Board of Huawei, and this opened my eyes to the speed at which China was adopting digital solutions, opportunities provided by a massive domestic market, and gave the lie to rather cozy Western ideas that Chinese companies were not developing their own IP or investing in R&D generally. And having spent the last few years immersed in the implications of the digital economy, because I speak on digital economy issues in Parliament, and AI, and I chaired the AI Select Committee in the Lords, and I've seen China's businesses develop online services and now AI in a myriad of sectors globally, I'm only too well aware of the immense culture of innovation in China, the way that businesses test their innovations in a hugely competitive marketplace that equips them to be highly competitive abroad, the phenomenon of swarms, which you'll read about in here. Successive chancellors of the Exchequer, such as Gordon Brown, George Osborne and Philip Hammond, have sensibly taken the view that a free trade approach to China with a positive inward investment policy must be the right thing for Britain. And I believe that standards of living have increased as a result across the West and the Pacific, and not just in China. The UK government has also taken the view that the Belt and Road Initiative is an opportunity for UK business, particularly our professional firms, and have sought to engage positively. In terms of total trade in goods and services, China is the UK's 5th largest trading partner and the 2nd largest non-EU partner after the US. And in 2016, UK-China trade was worth 60 billion, and it grew to nearly 70 billion in 2017. Given where we are too, with a trade war inspired, I believe, not by hard evidence of a national security threat, but by anti-competitive motives, increasing in tempo between the US and China, and consequent pressure on other Western governments to conform to US trade policy, I believe that the ability of Chinese companies to be extraordinarily agile in responding to change and uncertainty is going to stand them in good stead. Huawei being put on the US entities list and denied future access to Google Play Store will only make the delivery of the Made in China 2025 strategy more urgent. We'll rapidly see competitive homegrown sophisticated semiconductors and a mobile phone operating system appearing. In terms of the wider Chinese economy, we'll see a drive to self-sufficiency or supply from other Asian countries in their consumer economy. And we may even see China using rare earths in the US trade war. As the FT has pointed out this week, rare earths are the one raw material where China dominates global supply. None of this is desirable, and US companies will suffer without Chinese manufacturers in their supply chain or their products in Chinese supply chains. If in Britain we follow suit, we'll do ourselves enormous damage, not least in the rollout of 5G and in inward Chinese investment, which has been of such significance to our economy. £3.8 billion last year, even in a trough year, exceeding that by China in the US and indeed any other European country. So I do believe that our approach to Sino-British relations is the right one, and I don't agree with the recent conclusions of our Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which recommended that we recalibrate our relationship with China. Demonization of one of the great historic cultures will ultimately serve no purpose. Donald Trump characterized the vast majority of Chinese students in the US as spies, and they face increasing visa restrictions. Is it any wonder that they're increasingly reluctant to study in the United States? Over the years, I've seen the Sino-British dialogue, particularly on business and economic issues, become increasingly constructive and unscripted. Discussion on matters such as intellectual property, rule of law, company governance, and even labour conditions in Africa has led to real change. So if I was a betting man, and I must confess I am in fact, I would continue to place a great deal of importance on our economic relations with China. I hope that China's response won't simply be to batten down the hatches, but to demonstrate its free trade credentials through giving greater access to its domestic markets, as the EU itself has called for. That said, we now risk in the UK being brought into a trade war not of our making, and I would suggest, in a purely unbiased way of course, that this is another good reason for not going ahead with Brexit. As regards the future of Chinese business, I think in the context of today's launch, the old quote attributed to Anna Bevan holds true. Why gaze into the crystal ball when you can read the book, particularly this book? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this book launch. Actually, this is my third book launch at Imperial College, although each one has been under a different dean. But maybe my fourth one will still be with Francisco, I hope. So in fact, my previous book on China, the second book launch, was 3 years ago, China's Next Strategic Advantage from Imitation to Innovation. And in that book, we focused on large Chinese companies and on large Western companies as well. And it was probably one of the very first books to introduce the idea that China is innovating rather than imitating. In fact, our subtitle is From Imitation to Innovation. So this next book is with a different group of co-authors. I have to say, the first book I did most of the work for, and I'm pleased that in this second book, the younger people did a lot more of the work. That's one of the benefits. So Mark Grieven is Dutch. We used to be together at Rotterdam School of Management, and he speaks fluent Chinese and has spent many years in China, although he's now moved to IMD in Switzerland. And Wei Wei is an entrepreneur based in Shanghai. So this second book takes a different approach. It's mostly about the Chinese companies you don't know about, the thousands of unknown Chinese companies. And in fact, between the three of us, particularly Mark, we visited hundreds of Chinese companies. And I'm going to talk to you about that. So we've got 4 types: pioneers, hidden champions, changemakers, and underdogs, and lessons from Chinese innovators. But just before I get into the book, so the broader context, the world is starting to recognize that China is innovative. So, major magazines, Wired, Time, MIT Sloan Management Review, featuring the concept of innovation in China. Of course, China wasn't always so innovative in its past. During the Red Guard Revolution, and down here is something called Goople, which is an imitation of the iPhone. In China, not only do you have fake iPhones, you have fake Apple stores. So the entire store is fake. But that's the old China. The new China, very interested in innovation. Now, watch this. Look at the little girl. So mobile payments is very big in China now, even down to this age. And this has happened very quickly, just in the last few years. One of the things I'm going to say again at the end is that China is very fast at implementing innovations. It is faster than any other country in the world. So in addition to actually creating the innovations, China adopts the innovations extremely quickly. And this is perhaps their biggest advantage of all. And I'll finish up with that thought. So China's eager embrace of tech, great for innovation and experimentation, and they're also very demanding consumers. Here's another one. Chinese consumers love technology. So they love this robot waiter. By the way, all the robot waiter can do is to bring the dishes to the table, and a human waiter has to remove the dishes. They haven't quite got to the next stage yet. And yet, it's popular because the Chinese are so focused on technology. Of course, we used to say that China's reaching for the sky. They've gone beyond the sky. China has reached the backside of the moon. And in fact, the following week, The Economist had this cover, Red Moon Rising, Will China Dominate Science? So I'm going to address some of those issues here. And of course, we see real scientific innovations now from China. Huawei, which we've already heard about, and that the USA is resisting, is leading the world in 5G. And if the UK blocks Huawei, we'll fall behind in terms of 5G. So although Huawei had previous generations of innovations, there were more applied practical innovations, some technology innovations, but this really is advanced innovation by a Chinese company. And Huawei is probably still the most important Chinese company. So, the innovation imperative, first of all, customer needs in China have changed rapidly from its first commercialization 40 years ago, from 1978 onwards, and companies have had to adapt to keep meeting what Chinese customers want. Changing technology, we've heard that from Tim, artificial intelligence, digitization. China's embracing digitization extremely rapidly. Changing regulations, China's opening up, making it more possible. And in fact, of course, China has less regulation in some ways. We've seen some of the experiments with DNA sequencing and changing the genes of babies because they are less regulated. Changing growth markets. China is the home of really severe competition. We talk about the run of the Red Queen. Chinese companies have to run very fast to stay in the same place, as with Alice and the Red Queen and Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. And newly emerging and transforming industries and changing cost structure, and the millennials themselves are driving innovation. What else? Anyway, so China is on this rapid path up toward innovation, and the global GEM, Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, says the internal market dynamics, some of them growing 40% faster than global and regional averages. So there are some markets that grow really fast in China. Now, what is happening to the innovation capacity of China? The large domestic market is a great help. It means that an innovation is scalable. This is why, for example, China is now challenging Boeing and Airbus by launching a mid-sized commercial jet, because they've got a huge domestic market. They already have 500 advance orders for the C919 before it's finished its tests. World-class manufacturing, which is something that India doesn't have, for example, which is why India is not up there in terms of innovation. The large and growing talent pool, many of whom have been educated in the West. So locally trained Chinese scientists and engineers as part of a large pyramid headed by Chinese PhDs who've studied at Imperial College, MIT, Stanford, and so on, and whom China has attracted back. And I'll give you an example later on. The physical infrastructure, China has been extremely good at investing in physical infrastructure. Abundant private capital is the fuel of the innovation, and improved regulation and policy to support innovation. And now even the rise of the private sector, private equity, venture capital as the actors. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but this was presented 2.5 years ago at a conference at Oxford by a member of the Chinese Academy of Science. 22 strategic science and technology initiatives of strategic importance to China's modernization. I always find this slightly scary. Exploration of dark matter and dark energy, artificial life and synthetic biology, nanoscience and technology, space science. So really, the story is that the Chinese government is investing in lots of underlying science and technology. And you know, we still debate in the UK whether to have an industrial policy. China has had an industrial policy for the last 40 years, and it has really worked for them. And by the way, industrial policy also worked for Japan and South Korea as well. So, ubiquitous sensing-based informationized manufacturing systems. I'm not even sure what that is, but it's part of the Industry 4.0 that China is very interested in. And by the way, China's now buying German robotics companies using their cash and muscle. So here's a different kind of example. This was a company run by a graduate of the China Europe International Business School, where I was a professor for 5 years. So security vehicles, these typical of these sort of mid-sized Chinese companies, you'd think is not something suitable for the Chinese strategy of manufacturing in mass, shipping all over the world. Why not? Because it's small quantities, and because of local regulations, the vehicles are different in every country, and batch production. But the CEO decided to take a different approach. He put 100 engineers to work, using the low-cost engineers in China, just as they use low-cost manufacturing labor. He said, study requirements around the world and then report back. At the end of the year, they said, you know what? For every component, the doors, the windows, the engines, and so on, there are only about 3 or 4 variations. So now what they do is they manufacture the 3 or 4 variations centrally in China, ship it around the world for local assembly in regional centers. So by using low-cost engineers on a large scale, he has converted what I call a multi-local industry into a global industry. So this is not Nobel Prize winning innovation, but it's typical Chinese innovation in that it is highly profitable. The Chinese really want to make money out of innovation. They're not going to have any Xerox parks that make innovations that do not make money for them. Why do I show this picture of the fire at Notre Dame? Because it was partly saved by Chinese drones, aerial drones. They sent the aerial drones in to see where the fire was and therefore how they could help save it. Now, aerial drones are very interesting for Chinese innovation. It is actually the ideal kind of product for Chinese innovation. Not invented in China, but China now makes over 90% of the world's aerial drones. And it's a product that's not that complicated. It's motors, rotors, plastic parts, electronic parts. And it's perfect to innovate next door to the factory. So you design something with an extra rotor, and then you test it out, as opposed to, say, the iPhone that you design 5,000 miles away. So, of course, a Chinese company, Yihang, has now designed a drone that will carry a human being. They're launching this in the Middle East. Some of you may get to ride in it. Good luck. But anyway, that's the kind of a very emblematic Chinese innovation. So, in looking at these hundreds of companies that we researched, we thought, how can we group them? And we realized that there was really 2 dimensions. One was whether it was in a mass market or a niche market, and the other one was whether it was an older company, an incumbent, or a newcomer. And of course, coming from business schools, we found that everything is solved in a 2x2 matrix. Those of you who have studied in business schools will know. So the 2x2 explains it all. What do we have? First of all, the mass market incumbents, the pioneers, and I have here an image of the Admiral Zheng He from the early 15th century, who had a fleet that sailed all over the Indian Ocean to the coast of Africa, but for some reason they failed to commercialize this. Otherwise, you know, the Belt and Road would have been built much earlier, but they were the pioneers. hidden champions, incumbents, niche markets. Of course, this is the tennis player Li Na, who burst on the world, won 2 Open championships. Changemakers, who are newcomers in mass markets, and what we call underdogs in niche markets, and I'll talk about each one of them. So these are the companies that are recognized. The first, the pioneers in the first wave. Of course, Lenovo was probably the first one that became well known when it bought the IBM PC business. Haier, now the world's largest major appliance company, and of course, Huawei. These are the pictures of the CEOs. They built themselves in a very self-reliant way. No boundaries. They've now embraced digitization, very entrepreneurial. And as challenges to non-Chinese multinational companies, they have rapidly become global competitors. They all went global very early on, continuously transforming themselves, and are digitally enabled. And Haier is even experimenting with management innovation of the famous Jiju Jingying T, self-managed teams. So watch that space. We may even get management innovation out of a Chinese company. And there are about 30 to 40 of these pioneers. Now, among the pioneers, so Haier's famous for its appliances, its early washing machines. The innovation in China was that it washed crops as well as clothes. In the US market, they've recently launched a refrigerator that has 3 temperature compartments, and the in-between temperature compartment was designed to store the food that is the most important to Americans. Do you know what that is? Ice cream. Because when you take the ice cream out of the middle compartment, you don't have to wait, and Americans don't like to wait. It took a Chinese company to see that and to put in the innovation. Now they have waterless washing machines as their innovation. And so really moving ahead, and they've saved General Electric's major appliances company after they bought it. So this is what is starting to happen. Chinese company rises, starts to innovate, and then buys a dying Western business. So your GE major appliance is now owned by a Chinese company. So the second wave, of course, the famous BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, these internet-based companies, again, self-reliant. They are global competitors, continually transforming themselves. What's most interesting, actually, is the next slide about these. They have built tremendous ecosystems. I'm not going to go into the detail, but the point is that they are not standalone companies. They've built huge ecosystems around themselves. And some of the products, like WeChat, do so much. They combine so many different capabilities among them. All right, so another example of these internet-based early pioneer companies is Xiaomi, which makes mobile phones, but they're very famous for their fan organization. Fan in the sense of customers, not something that you wave. So they have the customers, they maintain zero distance to the market. They are continuously in contact through social media, getting input from the customers, which means they launch upgrades every week, and they test them every week. Beta versions tested with the customers. The customers suggest what they want, and then they launch them. So typical Chinese, that they have the capability to move really quickly and are very connected to the customer base. And social media tools like Weibo, WeChat, QQ Space, and their own forum. Now, next, the hidden champions. Companies that are less well known. They've grown rapidly from different kinds of routes. They have strong R&D capability, and they really believe in continuous product innovation. But one saying is that typically Chinese companies have twice as many models as a Western company at half the price. So they go very much for innovation proliferation. And they leverage the advantage of being hidden as well. Agility. Chinese companies just move much faster than Western companies. They're more agile. They're not so bound by processes. So, for example, a Chinese innovation process typically is half the time of 12 months instead of 24 months. We actually had a specific benchmarking study on that when we were in China. And they become global players
pretty quickly. There are around 200 of them. So I mentioned, so Mindray, medical devices, 2,000 R&D employees. R&D expenditures as 10% of their revenues. Hikvision, security cameras, rapidly growing. Hans Laser, laser equipment. Goldwind, wind energy. So mostly pretty technical kinds of companies. I also thought it'd be interesting to explain why they are called hidden champions. So unlike the early pioneers, where the CEOs and founders have really a personality cult and people know them very well, their CEOs are relatively low profile, they have limited media visibility, they're even geographically hidden, and they hide what their strategic intentions are. They don't say what they're planning to do. And this is where they hide. Of course, they still tend to be near the coast, but fairly spread out. And the largest number, of course, in Shenzhen, the most innovative area of China, the first zone to be developed under the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. Interesting to compare them with the German hidden champions. Of course, we got this phrase, hidden champions, from the German example, these famous Mittelstand German companies. They're much younger, 25 years, than the typical German companies, 100 years old. They're mostly publicly listed rather than mostly family owned. And their positioning is toward the middle end of the market rather than the high end of the market. By the way, these Chinese companies are starting to buy the German hidden champions because many of the founders are wanting to retire. Talent development, they have developed themselves rather than the famous German apprenticeship program. And it's still at the level of the founding team rather than the professional managers as in Germany. In Germany, and I've done a lot of work teaching these hidden champions in Germany, they really care about survival and stability rather than growth, whereas the Chinese companies, growth and speed is what they want. And one of the reasons is because their home market is very large, whereas the German home market is relatively small, especially for these specialized companies. Not that Germany is that small, but that these specialist hidden champions are all in niches, which are relatively small. Now, if we go to the underdogs, and I'll describe one of them in some depth. These are mostly founded by what we call elite entrepreneurs, people with a high level of education, may have a PhD from the West, who had early international exposure, again, under the radar, cutting edge, world-class technology, very much niche. And the challenges to non-Chinese companies, there are too many of them to count, science-driven, little or no media presence, around 150,000 of them. So again, just list some of them in Huihua Solar, in photovoltaic, biotechnology, again, all science-based. I'm going to talk to you about one of them. Royole, flexible display, founded in 2012. So I've been there 3 times. The first time just to do some research, and then twice bringing my executive MBA students on our week's tour of Hong Kong and China. So they started in the business of flexible display, very thin, and a major ambition is to replace the entire display panels of automobiles. This is why, after he got his PhD at Stanford, this is the founder, Bill Liu. After getting his PhD at Stanford, he started up the company, which is actually registered still in California, but all the operations pretty much are in China, except for a few scientists still in California. And their latest thing was that a few months ago, at the end of last year, they launched the world's first folding mobile phone. He beat Samsung and Huawei to this. When it's folded up, it's a mobile phone. When it's unfolded, it's an iPad. So it needs great display capabilities, needs manufacturing capabilities as well to be able to do that. So that's the genuine innovations by one of these 150,000 Chinese underdog companies. And then last of all, we have the Changemakers, sort of the next generation entrepreneurs, many of which are digital disruption, fueled by venture capital, they are highly visible, these ones, and they really need to go fast because many of them being digitally based, winner-take-all markets, win first, capture the market. Hard to see them coming. They're often from other industries. Digital business model applied to traditional industries, very user-centered, around 200 of them. Let's look at some examples. The one that you'll know most is perhaps Didi Chuxing, which beat out Uber. It defeated Uber in China. Uber sold out to them in exchange for cash and a share of them. So, and now they're starting to expand around the world. Toutiao, which is a media company that gives a personalized news feed to the users. And Mobike, I mean, a real business model innovation. These are non-docking hire bikes. So these are Boris bikes without the docks. They went a bit overboard because, you know, you've seen these pictures of hundreds of bikes just abandoned on street corners and so on, but very fierce competition, and they've been starting to expand internationally as well. And you see, you know, healthcare, and then fintech, of course, is a very big sector in China for sources of innovation. Another thing we looked at was that actually we have now had 5 generations of Chinese entrepreneurs. Typical China, 5 generations squeezed into about 30 years, not into 150 years. So the original pioneers, you know, born in the 1940s and 1950s, grassroots manufacturing industries, limited education. The founders of Lenovo, Huawei, Haier is this generation. Then a next generation called the 92 Pi, who often have a political background, still limited education in sectors beyond manufacturing, including real estate and finance. And then we have the internet generation. Ma Yan, of course, perhaps better known in the West as Jack Ma, who are market makers, university educated, although of course, as most of you know, he was originally a teacher of English, decided to found Alibaba. And then the 4th generation of technology, science-based engineers, elite education overseas, so Bill Yu of Royole is an example of that. And then lastly, we now have these disruptors, the digital generation, different industries, but definitely with a university education. So now, being an entrepreneur is very popular in China among younger Chinese. They do not have the problem that President George W. Bush said of France when he said, gee, they don't even have a word for entrepreneur in France. They love entrepreneurship. So the communist era was just a passing 30-year temporary phase. China has been liberalized now for longer than the communist period, which is really 30 years. And the post-Maoist economics is now 40 years. Now, the story we've been saying is that these Chinese companies are hidden. It is like an iceberg. Many of them are not visible to Western companies, to Western readers, which is why we wrote this book, in order to unhide them. And by the way, we know that icebergs are dangerous. You all saw the movie. These Chinese innovators are also going global. The bigger ones, the pioneers, such as the first one, Haier and Huawei, they build their own global innovation network. So Huawei invests a lot in R&D centers in China. They build R&D centers overseas. So for example, they have a center for microwave technology in Milan, Italy. Haier has built innovation centers in the US as well. And these bigger companies are also, as I said, buying Western companies for their innovation, including Geely buying Volvo for its partly for its innovation as well as for its brand. Or some next generation companies like Hikvision and Uwell, a company I wrote a case study about, medical equipment company, establishing overseas innovation bases. Or others, smaller ones, establishing technology outposts. So they've been much quicker. So Western companies internationalized at a much slower rate, and they did most of their R&D in their home countries. Chinese companies, knowing that they were behind, have rapidly moved to setting up R&D overseas or buying foreign companies for their existing R&D. The internet companies, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, building global digital ecosystems and starting to spread around the world. And in fact, there are now many places where they will be accepting payments, Chinese payments, from smartphones. Exporting their disruptive business models, and some of them are born global. They go global immediately. DJI is the company that makes the drones. So, we sort of summarize this by talking about 6 ways, the Chinese Innovators Way, 6 ways in which they are different. And I'll talk about a few of them. And one of the last chapters of the book talks about these 6 different ways. The swarming one is pretty much our concept. Nobody else has really talked about this. We call it swarm innovation. And this chart compares swarm innovation on the left versus developed market innovation on the right. So, you know, we teach in business schools that you should go for unique opportunities. Right? That's the traditional approach. Well, in swarm innovation, you actually have literally 100 Chinese companies or more all going for proven opportunities, the same thing. But a few of them will succeed. So many of the swarm will fall away. A small number of the swarm, maybe even only one, will succeed. So very much analogous to what bees do. They have many selling points, as opposed to looking for a single, unique selling point. They're market-driven rather than technology-driven. They really go after the market. And there's intense competition, as I said, between a large number of peers. It also makes life very difficult for Western companies in China. As one of them said to me, you know, we have 100 competitors in any product category, and we only need one of them to succeed to give us trouble. It won't be the same one in the next product category, but we have 100 in each product category. And it's more winner-take-all markets, whereas more developed market innovation, the companies try to diversify. And not so much technology clustering, but strong geographic market clustering. You'll find all these similar competitors in the same place. Decision-making, you probably all know that Chinese make decisions, or at least the modern Chinese companies make decisions very quickly. One of the reasons they can do this is that they are very boss-oriented. So one expression is the huddle and act. So the boss has a team that huddles around them, and they make decisions quickly, and they do it, and they're much less bound by processes. So one saying we came across, a Western executive said, you know, in the West, it is 70% process and 30% boss. In China, it's 90% boss and 10% process. By the way, I know what Chinese bosses are like because my father was one. And he once said to me, son, you should never contradict me, especially when I'm wrong. That is a Chinese boss. So, very decisive leadership, flat, flexible organization structures that ignore processes, cultural acceptance of doing things quickly and redoing them. So it's the fail fast philosophy. China goes for fail fast. And why can they do this? Because they have great implementation capability and the market is growing quickly. So in the West, when you've got low growth markets, highly regulated, companies don't dare to fail. They move much more slowly and there's much more sense of urgency. And I got this repeated when I went to a conference where the American head of the former GE major appliance division, now owned by Haier, said that they now move much more quickly, and the Chinese are much more willing to gamble on investments. Before, if you had an idea, you'd have had to go through the GE approval process, long and slow, and probably get turned down in the end based on potential return on investment. And as he put it, his Chinese boss now say to him, if you've got a good idea, tell us, build a factory, and we will fill it and make sure we sell it. So he's a much happier player now. So I've mentioned already China's implementation advantage. So the West, sorry, I should have really put a British flag here, but to be honest, it's an American flag. The West is very good at going from 0 to 1, and China is very good at going from 1 to 100. It is the implementation advantage in innovation. What's the latest example? Well, in this week's news, the 370-mile-an-hour maglev train planned by China, they will implement it because the top-down government will put in the infrastructure that is needed. How many miles of high-speed rail do we have in the UK? Yeah, what high speed? So they'll do it. And in fact, perhaps a bigger one is electric vehicles. China will be the first country to have an extensive electric vehicle business because the top-down government will solve the chicken and egg problem, right? What's the chicken and egg problem? People won't buy electric cars until they can charge them. So you need charging stations. So China has a big program to install charging stations all over the country. You need a top-down government to implement that. We're still struggling with HS2, the high-speed rail to the north. All right? So that's an example of the implementation. Artificial intelligence. China will probably win. Again, China didn't invent artificial intelligence, invented in the West, but China is implementing it very fast. Here are some of their advantages. We're now at the age of implementation. And in implementation, you don't need the Nobel Prizes. You need the willingness and ability, particularly, to collect data. China has lots of data collected by the government. They're not afraid of using the data. Not nearly so many privacy exclusions. And AI needs data to learn and grow. China already has thousands of AI-capable scientists and entrepreneurs. And China has a very mobile-centric society which generates lots of data. So watch out on artificial intelligence for China. Now, of course, China does face challenges. It has some innovation islands. Perhaps it's not learning enough. The system isn't open enough. There's overcapacity in many industries. There's still weak intellectual property rights enforcement, but it is improving. There was a crossover point 2 years ago when more Chinese companies sued other Chinese companies for IPR infringement than foreign companies suing Chinese companies. Right? So China now has intellectual property to protect. They're making the process faster and with more enforcement. And to some extent, the innovation system is closed. And of course, they've got this now Chinese wall internet system, which could be a real problem for them. One of the ways that Chinese companies get around this is that they set up an R&D center in Hong Kong where there is no restrictions on internet access. So they have the Hong Kong subsidiary then access worldwide information that, they may need. So what's the last competitive frontier for Chinese companies? What do you think is the thing that Chinese companies are not good at yet? Any ideas?
Fundamental R&D.
Yeah, fundamental R&D, but they're starting to get there because the government is putting money behind it. I'm really going beyond technical innovation now. For me, it's design and branding. After all, what made Apple the most valuable company in the world? Design. Right? So when Chinese companies learn design and branding, look out, because that is the last frontier. And I have a very specific example of this. When I interviewed the guy in charge of integrating Volvo into Geely, he said one of the things we learned from Volvo was the concept of a design family. Geely had many different models, they all look different. And they learn from Volvo that you need a uniform look. You know how you can tell a car is a Mercedes just by looking at the tail light or looking at BMW grille? So this is the kind of design elements the Chinese are starting to learn. And they haven't believed that much in branding yet, but they're starting to do that. So that's what I have to say, and this is good luck to all of you in working with Chinese innovation. So now there's time for some questions. Thank you very much. Oops. Questions? Yep.
You mentioned earlier that Chinese companies, they don't have that many processes and don't innovate very, very quickly. So how do you think this, obviously, from my perspective or a Western perspective, this is high, can increase risk, for example, products or capacity. Thinking about you mentioned the aerospace company,
Yeah.
planes. So how do they compensate?
No, I mean, they are putting in processes. They're just quicker. And
How do they make it so much quicker? For example, we have in the manufacturing improvement and development times.
I mean, they do take some more risks. But for example, Huawei hired consultants from IBM to put in a Western-style innovation process for themselves, but they adapted it to their own situation. And I think just because they're oriented to making decisions quickly, they just go through the steps more quickly. Did you want to comment on that? Yeah. So.
I've got a question I wanted your opinion on. I've sort of had this theory for a while, but one of the, and I think it's coming through actually in what you're saying, is that Chinese are quite good at taking an idea that's already been found, discovered,
Yep.
and improving it. But they're not very good at creating that first, 1.0 version. And could the barrier to that be linguistic? And the reason I say that is because the Chinese alphabet is so complicated and it's pictorial that by the time the Chinese student learns the alphabet, he's much older than, say, someone who's studying, say, the Latin alphabet with 26 characters. So that would be a question I have to you. And also, does it not maybe, the way you have to learn that alphabet constrain you to a sort of rote learning approach, and therefore we're very good at improving things, but we're not necessarily very good at creativity, or is that unfair?
I see someone shake. You're shaking your head. Do you want to comment on that?
Just commenting on he doesn't understand the Chinese culture.
Say that again.
He doesn't understand the culture.
I mean, writing system being pictorial.
is contextual.
Yeah. But by the way, there is going to be a change because more and more of the younger generation are now relying on their smartphones to do the writing. So, in fact, the older generation are complaining they don't know the words as well, so that may make a fundamental difference. I think a bigger problem is not so much the language as the culture of sitting there, listening to the professor, not questioning the teacher. So that doesn't help innovation. Although they're working on that, and Chinese government is paying Duke University in the USA to train Chinese university teachers to teach Chinese students to be more innovative. So once again, the USA is helping China to compete with the USA. Okay? So China does recognize this problem, but they are working on it. And we were also told that once a Chinese engineer joins a Western company and works there for a year, they then develop the more open thinking, flexible approaches. So they can change.
How do you square off the tension between those 2 points, between the boss is always right versus the want to build more innovation within a business?
Yeah, I think that it's actually a culture that allows a lot of challenging. Even though the boss is on top, they have a team. So it's not a keep silent kind of the boss is right. You can challenge the boss, partly because the boss builds a family-like relationship with the team. Okay.
I wanted to touch upon something you referenced about India earlier, and how would you benchmark India to China in terms of innovation, kind of the pace of industrialization? one time there were talks of both emerging economies. I don't even call them emerging anymore. China seems to beat India in quite a lot of areas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they started in the same place, and China, and they have the same population, 1.3, 1.4 billion. China's GDP is 4 times that of India. And while India has a lot of brilliant scientists and engineers, they don't have the manufacturing capability, they don't have the infrastructure, and that's what's holding them back. I mean, the best example of this, if we look at a rare Indian success, that's Infosys, the software company, software services company. And when I visited there, the CEO said to us, he said, one reason we're successful is that we got around India's infrastructure problems by putting our own satellite in the sky. Once we had an Infosys satellite in the sky, we were free of India. So he was able to get the good aspects of India, which was the smart engineers and software people, but free themselves. But that's a specialized kind of product category. We're not going to see. It's hard to imagine India competing with China in manufactured goods because the infrastructure is such a mess. Of course, the other disadvantage is that China's a homogeneous society, and India is so heterogeneous in languages, culture, religion, and everything else. Yeah.
I mean, you just touched upon what I was going to talk about, because I believe there's a lot less friction in China because it's such a homogenized society, and to be honest, like the leadership in China is like when something needs to be done, it is done. Because I mean, for example, in India they just finished an election where one half was naming and shaming the other half, and now they would spend 5 years in power, and the next 5 years it's going to happen again. So I mean, there's a lot of bureaucracy that goes with that, which I think is absent in China. I mean, for example, like I live in the Middle East, and I mean it's also where power is concentrated a lot at the center. So if development needs to happen, we just say we're going to build 5 buildings here, and it's done. There's not much bureaucracy. There's not much processes, and I'm not gonna get into the debate of the morality of democracy or whatever, autocracy or whatever. But I think that's like a fundamental reason why the speed of innovation is there. Because, like to what she said, how come risks are taken? I mean, I just believe that because you have such a centralized focus of power, it enables you to make quicker decisions and make more efficient decisions.
Yeah, you remember that the people who get to the top of the Communist Party are very capable people. They've actually had to work their way up through the system. Do you know what percentage of the adult population belongs to the Chinese Communist Party? Give me a guess. What do you think?
So, I mean, what do you mean belongs?
No. Is a member of the party. What percentage of the adult population is a member of the party in China? What do you think? Any idea? What do you think? 90%? It's between 7 and 8%. It's small enough to be an elite, and it's big enough to control nearly everything. So at the school I was at, the joint venture school, of course we had a Communist Party chapter. The Chinese president was a member of the party. The Chinese co-dean was a member of the party. The head of human resources was the head of the party. And I had 3 young women working for me in my center. 2 of them were members of the party. And they had a monthly school meeting. And I said to one of them, "What do you talk about in the monthly school Communist Party meeting?" And she said, "Oh, we talk about you." All right, so they know what is going on. So.
Do you see company culture changing as they scale up and, for example, dominate market? Mobile has, I think, recently become the dominant player in the dockless bike sharing market. Do you see that company becoming more process heavy and constrained now?
I mean, they are adding processes. They don't seem to have been constrained. Actually, I think the big challenge for them is the hours. The workers are starting to kick back against the hours. Do you know the expression 996 companies? That means you work 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. So the younger workers are going against that. That is, of course, there is a law in China that it's supposed to be a 45-hour work week, but they're not following the law. But they're starting to enforce it. At the back.
Just a couple of questions. One, given your account, it sounds like Western companies might get
Yeah, I mean, to survive, Western companies will have to become faster. They'll have to continue to invest in their technology. They'll have to perhaps do even more in China to take a share of the Chinese market, because it's hard to fight the Chinese competitors if you don't go to China as well. You know, if you just wait for them to come to your market, it's already too late. And plenty of big Western companies have done very well in China and are surviving. So there's plenty of scope for that, so long as they maintain their competitive advantages in technology, superior branding and marketing and business processes. Your second question, I mean, that is really a negotiating fight between Donald Trump and China. So he's the great negotiator. I suspect he won't kill off Huawei. There was another company, I just blanked out, that he nearly killed off about last year, ZTE, and backed off, so hasn't killed off ZTE. But it's interesting that the USA may have the power to kill off the most important company in China. That's very hard to predict what's going to happen in that situation. Renzo?
In your opinion, do you think that the Belt and Road strategy should be an outstanding opportunity for the countries, or it's a dangerous new form of colonization, especially in places where there is a weaker democracy?
Yeah. I mean, there is the good point. There is the criticism that China's loading a lot of debt on these countries, but they're getting something out of it. I mean, they're getting a lot of infrastructure development. I mean, China genuinely believes in infrastructure development because that has really helped China. And these third world countries, they really suffer from bad infrastructure. But I think it's good that there's been the warning about being overburdened with debt so that people are more aware of it. So they make sure they get something good in return for that. Yep.
We've seen in your slide that most of the companies are kind of privately owned, as in the owner doesn't really have any connection with the government. But you know how China is a country where you have a state-owned enterprise in almost every industry. Do you think those state-owned enterprise might not become a problem for innovation? What's their role in?
Oh yeah, the state-owned companies are definitely less innovative. In fact, I saw an interesting statistic, something like the state-owned enterprises, have 75% of the employees, 2/3 of the assets, and 1/3 of the profits in the corporate sector. So they're just a lot less. They're a lot less profitable. The other thing they can evolve. Hire started out as what was called a township and village enterprise, which was state-owned, and they've now sort of become a private company. And the current government is a bit equivocal about what to do with the state-owned companies. It was supposed to continue to reform them, but under Xi Jinping, they've sort of backed off from that. So, but it's not the state-owned enterprises that are doing the main. So when you use the word private, you mean non-state-owned, as opposed to publicly listed. Many of them are publicly listed, but private in that sense.
So many people talking about Western creativity, etc. With all this creativity, the West today we arrived in low growth, protectionism, populism everywhere in the West. Looking at the Chinese growing model, it's very similar. It's based on demand by the customers' demand, consumerism. So they have to produce for the world and they have to produce for them. So what model do you think? How are they going to solve this problem when they arrive where the West arrived today? But still, we're talking about zero growth, zero inflation, protectionism, populism. Will China end up in the same place?
It might, but it'll be quite far down the road. Right? I think maybe just 2 or 3 more questions, then we'll have to stop.
So many of the tech companies that you mentioned as being very innovative. How big a role were the Googles, the Facebooks being banned in China in their growth?
Well, of course, yes. I mean, BAT particularly, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, they couldn't have grown unless the government had made life difficult for for Googles and others like that. But now they're beyond that. They are successful in their own right. And even if Google got back in, they wouldn't be able to compete with them.
They confirmed the Chinese
Well, they did in the past, and they still continue to do that to some extent, but they're now developing a lot of their own technology, okay? And because they spend a huge amount on R&D, so they wouldn't do that if they were just stealing technology.
If there was one action we could all take today to join the wave of growth, what would you think that should be?
Learn Chinese. Well, I mean, you know, do business with Chinese companies. So if you're in a company, find some way, from a business perspective, find a way to tap into the Chinese innovation ecosystem by partnering with them, supplying them, having them supply you, etc. So that's the answer for a company. And then for individuals, indeed, it is to learn Mandarin. In the 50s, the old joke was an optimist is learning Russian and a pessimist is learning Chinese. Now it's the other way around, I think.
I got a question relating to one of the questions you guys asked.
Yeah.
So you talk about Huawei as a Chinese airplane in the sea, like whatnot. And with all the fundamental technology already invented by the West, like the chips making,
Yeah.
and the manufacturing of the engines.
Yeah.
What do you see the way out for the Chinese company that can't, reinvent the wheel today? So what is the way out for Chinese company?
Well, what we've seen is that Chinese companies tend to go for incremental innovation. So they take the base innovation and they keep steadily improving it, and that way gradually increasing the margins that they can earn. So I'm not interested in whether or not they win Nobel Prizes. I'm interested to study whether or not they're going to gain global market share. And they're continuing to do that with their incremental innovations. And we've actually seen the success of Airbus, which was heavily subsidized. It has now fought Boeing to a draw. In fact, it has a higher market share than Boeing now. And I can see the Chinese really, it will take 20 years, but they'll end up with a third of the market. And it will eventually become profitable for them. Okay, I think we should draw it to a close. I think Tim Ruthven from our Executive Education is going to say final words. Before he does, I'd like to point out that I'll be signing the books outside immediately after this when we have the drinks reception. There's a bookseller there.
Hi, I'm Tim Ruthven. I'm representing Executive Education tonight, but I'm also an Imperial College alumnus and was a student of George here at the college. And I remember in our classes you talked about your first book quite a bit, and I bought it and read it. It was very interesting to hear about some of these larger companies and what they're doing in innovation in China, and the story about the ice cream was one that I always remembered. And just like to thank you very much for coming and sharing. I bought a book. I'd encourage you guys to do the same. You can get it outside. Also, I'd like to thank our guest, Lord Clement, for coming and talking tonight. I really appreciate that. And I also wanted to touch on executive education at Imperial. I'm heading up the short course programs at the moment, and we run 2, 3, 5-day programs where we take some of the thinking and research of our academics and translate it into practice for industry. So if you're an alumnus like myself and you've been out of the college for a while and you want to come on campus and maybe get a taste of some of the research and thinking that you might be able to apply in your working life today, then have a look at our website. We've got upcoming courses in ideas innovation, so the whole design side, design thinking and how we ideate in that space. And there's also courses in digital transformation, which is a new program, and cybersecurity, which is one which a lot of business leaders are coming back from. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thank you very much, George and Lord Morgan, for joining us. And I think we have drinks waiting for us outside.